The emergency klaxon screamed across Pensacola Naval Air Station as an F-35 Lightning II spiraled toward the Gulf, its rookie pilot's panicked voice crackling through the radio. Michelle Anderson stood behind the visitor information desk, her graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a faded volunteer polo shirt with sleeves rolled down to her wrists. At 41, she looked like any other base volunteer. Weathered hands, comfortable sneakers, the kind of woman visitors barely noticed. The flight operations chief burst through the doors, shouting over the alarms. "We need an experienced pilot now! That kid's got 30 seconds before impact!" His eyes swept past Michelle completely, scanning for someone who looked the part. Michelle's fingers unconsciously traced the fabric covering her left forearm, hiding the faded Navy test pilot wings tattooed there 15 years ago, when she became one of the first women to fly experimental aircraft. The ink nobody knew existed. The F-35's engines screamed overhead, black smoke trailing like a death sentence. Before we continue, if you believe our female veterans deserve the same respect as their male counterparts, type "respect" below, and tell me where you're watching from. This story hits different when I know who's standing with Michelle Anderson. I read every comment. Michelle had been working at the visitor center for 3 years, filing papers and answering tourists' questions about base tours. Nobody asked about her background. Nobody cared to. She preferred it that way, invisible, unremarkable, just another civilian employee in a polo shirt. The base commander, Admiral Roberts, stormed past her desk without a glance. "Get me every qualified pilot on base," he barked into his radio. "I don't care if they're off duty." A young ensign, barely out of flight school, stood near Michelle's desk, his face pale as he watched the screens. "Ma'am," he said to Michelle, his voice shaking, "you should probably evacuate to the shelter. This is going to be bad." Michelle's eyes stayed locked on the monitors showing the F-35's erratic flight path. The pilot, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, according to his file, was 23 years old, fresh out of training. This was supposed to be a routine navigation exercise. "Control tower to any available aircraft," the radio crackled. "We have a code red emergency. Pilot experiencing complete instrument failure and spatial disorientation." Michelle's hand pressed against her sleeve, feeling the raised edges of the tattoo beneath the fabric. Those wings represented 4 years of the most dangerous flying in the Navy, testing prototype aircraft that had killed 3 pilots before her. She'd been the first woman to successfully complete the experimental F-35 trials, but that was 15 years ago. Before the accident that grounded her permanently, before the medical discharge that ended her career, before she became just another forgotten veteran working a desk job. The young ensign was still talking, something about evacuation procedures, but Michelle wasn't listening. She was calculating wind patterns, thinking about emergency landing protocols, remembering the feel of an F-35's controls under extreme stress. Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through the radio again, higher now, panic creeping in. "Control, I can't see the horizon. Everything's spinning. I don't know which way is up." Michelle closed her eyes. She'd heard that same panic in her own voice once during a test flight that went wrong. The difference was she'd had the training to get out of it alive. The flight operations chief was shouting orders, coordinating with search and rescue, preparing for the worst. Nobody was talking about saving the aircraft anymore. They were talking about recovering the pieces. Michelle stood up from her desk, her chair rolling back on squeaky wheels. The ensign looked at her with confusion. "Ma'am, where are you going?" She didn't answer. She was already walking toward the flight line, her comfortable sneakers silent on the polished floor, her sleeves still hiding the wings that might be the only thing standing between Lieutenant Morrison and the Gulf of Mexico. "Excuse me, ma'am." The security guard stepped into Michelle's path as she approached the restricted flight line. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of crisp uniform that screamed, "By the book." Civilian personnel need to evacuate immediately." Michelle paused, her eyes still tracking the F-35's erratic pattern through the gray sky. "I can help with the emergency." The guard's eyebrows shot up and he actually laughed. Help? Lady, this isn't a lost tourist situation. We've got a fighter jet about to crash. He gestured toward the visitor center. Your job is answering phones and handing out brochures. Behind him, a group of maintenance technicians had gathered, watching the drama unfold. One of them, a grizzled chief petty officer with oil-stained coveralls, shook his head. Great. Now the volunteers think they're pilots. Another tech, younger with a cocky grin, chimed in. Next, she'll be telling us she flew combat missions. He mimed flight controls with his hands, his buddies snickering. Michelle's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. I have flight experience. Oh, flight experience, the security guard repeated in a mocking tone. Let me guess. You took a civilian flying lesson once? Maybe went up in a Cessna? He turned to the techs. She's got flight experience, guys. The laughter was sharp, cutting through the emergency sirens. The chief petty officer walked closer, looking Michelle up and down with obvious disdain. Honey, that thing up there isn't a tourist ride. It's a $40 million killing machine, and right now it's about to take a kid with it. Ma'am, you need to move. The security guard's patience was wearing thin. I don't want to have to escort you back. Michelle's fingers pressed against her sleeve again. The tattoo felt like it was burning under the fabric. She'd earned those wings in weather worse than this, in aircraft that were literally falling apart around her. But standing here in her volunteer polo, with her graying hair and comfortable shoes, she looked like exactly what they saw, a middle-aged woman playing dress-up. A flight instructor emerged from the operations building, his face grim. Captain Harrison was maybe 35, with the kind of confident swagger that came from years in the cockpit. He glanced at Michelle and the gathering crowd with irritation. What's the holdup here? He demanded. The security guard straightened. Sir, this civilian thinks she can help with the emergency. But Captain Harrison's expression shifted from irritation to disbelief. Are you serious? He looked at Michelle like she'd suggested something completely insane. Ma'am, we're dealing with a multi-million-dollar aircraft and a pilot's life. This isn't amateur hour. I understand the situation, Michelle said quietly. Do you? Harrison stepped closer, his voice rising. Because what I see is a volunteer who's watched too many movies and thinks she knows something about flying. He gestured at her clothes, her appearance. You look like someone's mom, not a pilot. The maintenance techs were loving this. The cocky one pulled out his phone, actually starting to record. This is going viral, he muttered to his buddy. Volunteer thinks she's Top Gun. Michelle stood there, absorbing their mockery, their dismissal, their absolute certainty that she was nothing more than what she appeared to be. The F-35's engine screamed overhead, and she could hear Lieutenant Morrison's increasingly desperate radio calls. Control! I'm losing altitude. I can't hold it much longer. Captain Harrison turned away from Michelle dismissively. Get her out of here, he told the security guard. We've got real work to do. But Michelle didn't move. She was done being invisible. She reached for her left sleeve and slowly rolled it up, revealing the faded but unmistakable Navy test pilot wings tattooed on her forearm. The wings of someone who had flown missions they couldn't even imagine. The laughter stopped. The tattoo was faded but unmistakable. Navy test pilot wings with the distinctive experimental aircraft designation beneath. Michelle's forearm, exposed now for the first time in years at this base, bore the mark of someone who had flown aircraft that existed only in classified files. Captain Harrison's confident smirk disappeared. He stared at the tattoo, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The maintenance techs stopped recording, their phones lowering as the reality of what they were seeing sank in. Test pilot wings, the chief petty officer whispered, his oil-stained hands suddenly still. Jesus Christ! The security guard looked confused, glancing between Michelle's face and her forearm. What does that mean? It means, Harrison said slowly, his voice completely changed, that she's flown aircraft we've never even heard of. He stepped closer to Michelle, studying the tattoo with new eyes. Those wings, When did you get them? 15 years ago, Michelle said simply, after I successfully completed the F-35 prototype trials. The words hit like a physical blow. The F-35 prototype trials were legendary in Navy aviation. 3 pilots had died before the aircraft was declared safe for production. Only a handful of pilots had ever flown those early models. "You're telling me," the cocky maintenance tech said, his voice now uncertain, "that you flew the F-35 before it was even operational?" Michelle's eyes moved to the struggling aircraft above them. Serial number 3201 through 3208. I logged over 400 hours in prototype testing. Her voice was matter-of-fact, carrying the weight of absolute truth. Including emergency recovery procedures. Captain Harrison's face had gone pale. He was doing the math, connecting the timeline. 2008 to 2009, the experimental test program. He looked at Michelle with something approaching awe. They said the first woman to fly those prototypes was Anderson. Michelle Anderson. "Still am," she said quietly. The chief petty officer removed his cap, running his hands through his gray hair. "Ma'am, we didn't know. Your records, they're not in the general system." "Classified," Michelle explained. "Most of what we did was above top secret. New aircraft, new weapon systems, new limits." She gestured toward the F-35 spiraling overhead. "Including what to do when everything goes wrong at once." The radio crackled with Lieutenant Morrison's voice, weaker now, resigned. "Control. I've lost engine power on the starboard side. I'm going down." Michelle's hand moved to the tattoo, her fingers tracing the wings that had cost her everything. The accident that ended her career had happened during one of those classified flights. An experimental engine failure that she'd managed to survive, barely, but which had left her with injuries that grounded her permanently. "The medical discharge," Harrison said, understanding dawning. "You didn't choose to leave. Spinal compression fractures, mild traumatic brain injury, partial hearing loss," Michelle recited clinically. "Flight status revoked, medical retirement at 36. She looked up at the F-35. "But my hands still remember." The young ensign from the visitor center had followed the crowd, and now he stared at Michelle with wide eyes. "Ma'am, if you can fly that thing—" "The question," Michelle interrupted, "is whether they'll let me." Admiral Roberts was approaching, his face grim, flanked by other senior officers. He'd been coordinating the emergency response, but someone had radioed him about the situation developing on the flight line. Captain Harrison straightened, his entire demeanor changed. "Admiral, this is Michelle Anderson." She was part of the F-35 prototype program. Roberts stopped dead, his eyes moving from Michelle's face to the tattoo on her forearm. "Anderson," he repeated slowly. "Your name's in our emergency protocols. I thought you were dead." "Not yet," Michelle said. Above them, Lieutenant Morrison's F-35 banked sharply, black smoke pouring from both engines now. "Sir," Michelle said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced death in experimental aircraft, "I can bring him home." Admiral Roberts stared at the faded tattoo, memories clicking into place. "Anderson, test pilot class of 2008. You're the one who survived the engine explosion at 30,000 feet. Michelle nodded once. "F-35A, prototype 3205. Complete hydraulic failure, both engines out, electrical systems fried." Her voice was steady, clinical. "I dead-sticked it into Eglin from 12 miles out." The circle of officers around them had grown silent. What Michelle had just described was impossible. Landing a prototype fighter jet with no power, no controls, and no instruments was the kind of thing that existed only in legends. "That landing," Roberts continued, "is still used in training scenarios. We just never knew." He gestured at her civilian clothes, her humble appearance. "What the hell are you doing working a visitor's desk?" Michelle's eyes never left the struggling F-35 above them. "Medical discharge ended my flying career, but it didn't end my need to serve." She paused. "Some of us just serve quieter, Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled through the radio again, desperation clear. Control! I'm at 3,000 feet and falling fast. I don't think I can make it back to base. Captain Harrison stepped forward. Admiral, with respect, she's been out of the cockpit for 15 years. The F-35s we're flying now are completely different from the prototypes. Different how? Michelle asked. Harrison looked uncertain. Well, the avionics systems have been upgraded, the flight controls are more responsive, and the basic aerodynamics are identical, Michelle interrupted. The emergency procedures I developed for spatial disorientation in prototype testing, they're still in your manual, aren't they? Roberts nodded slowly. Chapter 7, Section 4, the Anderson Protocol. Michelle felt a cold satisfaction. Her accident had nearly killed her, but her emergency procedures had saved countless lives since then. Lieutenant Morrison is experiencing vertigo-induced spatial disorientation combined with partial system failure. Standard recovery won't work because he can't trust his instruments. So, what do you do? The young ensign asked. Michelle was already walking toward the backup F-35 on the flight line. You talk him through it, step by step, using external references and kinesthetic recovery. She paused. But first you get up there beside him. Ma'am, the security guard called after her. You can't just... Let her go, Roberts commanded. The maintenance crew scrambled to prep the backup aircraft, their earlier mockery completely forgotten. The chief petty officer personally supervised the final checks, his hands shaking slightly as he realized he was preparing an aircraft for a legend he'd never known existed. Michelle approached the F-35, her comfortable sneakers silent on the tarmac. She'd been away from this moment for 15 years, but her body remembered everything. The weight of the helmet, the feeling of strapping into an ejection seat, the particular smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid. Ma'am, the cocky maintenance tech approached her, his earlier recording forgotten. I wanted to apologize. We didn't know. You couldn't have known, Michelle said simply. That was the point. She climbed into the cockpit, her movements automatic despite the years away. Her hands found the controls, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought would have failed. The tattoo on her forearm felt warm now, as if the ink was responding to being back where it belonged. The radio headset crackled to life. Lieutenant Morrison's voice was barely holding together. Control, I'm at 2,000 feet. I can see the water. Michelle's voice, calm and authoritative, came through the radio for the first time in 15 years. Lieutenant Morrison, this is Commander Anderson. I'm coming up to bring you home. The use of her old rank was automatic, natural. For 15 years, she'd been Michelle the volunteer, Michelle the file clerk, Michelle the invisible. But 30,000 feet above sea level, she had always been Commander Anderson. And Commander Anderson never lost a pilot. The F-35's engines roared to life beneath Michelle's hands, 15 years of silence finally broken. Every switch, every gauge, every subtle vibration came back to her like a language she'd never really forgotten. The aircraft taxied to the runway, her movements precise despite the years away from the cockpit. Commander Anderson, Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. I can barely see anything. The instruments are all red, and I think I'm upside down. Copy that, Lieutenant. I'm 2 minutes out. Michelle's voice carried the calm authority that had once talked dozens of test pilots through impossible situations. Stay with me. We're going to work through this together. On the ground, Admiral Roberts watched the backup F-35 streak into the sky with something approaching awe. 15 years out of the cockpit, he muttered to Captain Harrison. I wouldn't attempt what she's doing with 15 minutes out. Harrison was tracking both aircraft on radar, his face tense. She's closing on Morrison's position fast. But Admiral, if she's wrong about this, then we lose 2 aircraft instead of 1, Roberts finished grimly. Above the Gulf, Michelle's F-35 sliced through storm clouds toward the struggling aircraft. Lieutenant Morrison's jet was indeed inverted, spiraling in a controlled descent that would become uncontrolled within minutes. She could see black smoke streaming from multiple systems, the clear signs of cascading failures that would kill him if not addressed immediately. Lieutenant, I'm visual on your aircraft. You're inverted and in a descending spiral. I need you to trust my voice, not your instruments. Commander, I can't tell which way is up. Everything's spinning. Michelle positioned her aircraft alongside Morrison's, close enough to see into his cockpit. The young pilot's helmet was visible, his head moving frantically as he tried to make sense of his malfunctioning displays. Look to your right, Lieutenant. Do you see my aircraft? Yes, ma'am. I see you. Good. I'm your reference point now. Forget your instruments. They're lying to you. I need you to match my attitude exactly. Michelle's hands moved the controls with surgical precision, demonstrating the exact movements Morrison needed to make. On the ground, the maintenance crew gathered around the radio, listening to a master class in emergency flying. The cocky tech who had mocked Michelle earlier was recording again, but this time with reverence, not ridicule. She's teaching him to fly by feel, the chief petty officer whispered. Just like the old days, before we had computers to do everything. Michelle's voice continued, steady and reassuring. Small movements, Lieutenant. Your aircraft wants to fly. Don't fight it. Feel the pressure on the stick, the way the aircraft responds. Forget what the screens are telling you. Slowly, incrementally, Morrison's F-35 began to level out. The smoke was still streaming, and several systems were still failing, but the death spiral was broken. Commander, I think I've got it. Morrison's voice was stronger now, more confident. You do have it, Michelle confirmed. Now, we're going to bring you home. The two aircraft formed up, flying wing to wing through increasingly rough weather. Michelle became Morrison's eyes, his instruments, his confidence, everything the sophisticated computer systems should have been, but had failed to provide. Pensacola Control, this is Commander Anderson. I have Lieutenant Morrison in formation, flying damaged aircraft. Request priority landing, emergency vehicles standing by. Copy, Commander Anderson. You're cleared for straight-in approach, runway 08. All traffic cleared. As they descended toward the base, Michelle felt something she hadn't experienced in 15 years, the pure satisfaction of flying a mission that mattered. The tattoo on her forearm seemed to pulse with life. The wings that had been hidden for so long finally spread wide again. 2 miles out, Lieutenant. You're doing beautifully. Just follow me down. Below them, Pensacola Naval Air Station waited, emergency vehicles lined up along the runway, hundreds of personnel watching the sky. The two F-35s touched down within seconds of each other, Lieutenant Morrison's damaged aircraft trailing sparks and smoke as it rolled to a stop. Emergency crews rushed forward, foam and medical personnel surrounding both jets as they powered down. Michelle climbed out of her cockpit, her legs slightly unsteady after 15 years away from high-G maneuvers. She removed her helmet, her graying hair damp with sweat, and looked toward Morrison's aircraft where medics were helping the young pilot out of his cockpit. Lieutenant Morrison stumbled across the tarmac toward her, his face pale, but his eyes bright with life. When he reached Michelle, he stopped and rendered a perfect salute, his voice breaking with emotion. Commander Anderson, you saved my life. Michelle returned the salute, 15 years of civilian anonymity falling away in that moment. You saved your own life, Lieutenant. You just needed someone to remind you how. Admiral Roberts approached, followed by what seemed like half the base personnel. Word had spread quickly through Pensacola. The volunteer from the visitor center was Commander Michelle Anderson, the legendary test pilot whose emergency procedures were still taught to every Navy aviator. Commander, Roberts said formally, your actions today exemplify the highest traditions of naval aviation. He paused, looking at the tattoo still visible on her forearm. I have a question, though. Why didn't you ever tell us who you were? Michelle looked around at the crowd of faces, officers, enlisted personnel, civilians, many of them people who had passed her desk countless times without a second glance. Because being a hero isn't about recognition, Admiral. It's about being ready when you're needed. The chief petty officer from the maintenance crew stepped forward, his oil-stained cap in his hands. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do. We judged you by appearances, and we were wrong. You judged me by what you could see, Michelle corrected gently. That's natural. But this uniform, she gestured to her volunteer polo, has served just as honorably as any flight suit. For 3 years, I've been helping families understand what their loved ones do here. That matters too. Captain Harrison, who had been so dismissive earlier, stepped forward. Commander, the Navy needs pilots like you. Your medical clearance was 15 years ago. Would you consider returning to active status? Michelle smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face. Captain, I'm 41 years old. I've been out of the cockpit for 15 years, and my medical records probably read like a disaster novel. She paused. But if the Navy thinks it can use an old test pilot, I'm willing to discuss it. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Michelle raised her hand for quiet. However, I want to make something clear. For 3 years, this base has been my home. The people here, from the newest recruit to the most senior officer, they're family. Flying today wasn't about proving anything. It was about bringing one of our own home safely. Lieutenant Morrison, who had been receiving medical attention, broke away from the medics and rejoined the group. Commander Anderson, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd, I don't know how to thank you. Live, Michelle said simply. Fly well. Take care of your people. That's thanks enough. Admiral Roberts stepped forward one final time. Commander Anderson, by the authority vested in me as base commander, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions today. He paused. And I'm also recommending that your previous service record be declassified. The Navy has hidden your achievements long enough. Michelle felt tears threatening for the first time since climbing out of the cockpit. The tattoo on her forearm, faded, hidden for so long, caught the late afternoon sun, the wings seeming to shimmer with new life. To everyone who typed respect and shared where you're watching from, thank you for standing with our heroes. Subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.